Hey guys, it is exceptionally rainy outside today, so I'm not going to go on the camper to work, but I wanted to go ahead and get started on a little explanation of where I am in my process and what I usually do to get started in writing. With this book, it really kind of came to me almost completely formed, with the plot fairly well laid out. When I woke up one day, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just starts with a little seed of, hey, I'd like to write about this era, or maybe this human dynamic or whatever. And it's it's anybody's guess as to where your inspiration comes from and how it comes to you. In this particular case, I started reading this book and I got this idea for another story that kind of integrated it. And then I spent most of my time in the camper through 2024 gathering research for it. So let's talk a little bit about what I recommend for the getting started process. I do think that regardless of how fully shaped your idea is in the beginning, it is really important to map out your course with some strategic planning, because it's going to help you with some of the obstacles you're going to run into with writing and creative blocks and that kind of thing. So for me, what that looked like was I had wanted to do some traveling, and realized that if I was going to write this book, I needed to see some of the places that were going to be covered in it. So that's why I set out in the camper to take Steinbeck's route around the country and follow what he did in that. And I had certain ideas for how that was going to take shape. I thought I'd be doing lots of interviews and interacting with people, and it didn't really play out that way. I visited those locations and I did have some organic interactions with people, but because I was staying in campgrounds for most of my travels, I was interacting with other people who were also traveling, who were not residents of those areas. There were a few exceptions where people lived in the general area and they would come in their campers to a campground for a little vacation and getaway, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I was visiting with other fellow travelers. So that didn't afford me the insights into the types of people that were in those communities as much as I'd hoped it would. Where I did get it was like if I went into a grocery store, a gas station, or maybe the people who worked at the campground were where I was able to get kind of a feel for, dialects and, the way they carried themselves and interacted with other people and those kinds of things. So, I was a little bit limited in that regard, but I did get a feel for each place I was in through that. And of course, as you've seen in all the videos that I posted, I got a feel for the landscape and the climate and all of those kinds of things, which also helps with what I was trying to accomplish. And then beyond that, if I do need any further research on a particular area, I can rely on internet searches for some things. So I think I'm okay in that regard. But in your case, maybe you're writing something that is set in 15th century England. Obviously, you're not going to be able to go visit 15th century England to get a realistic feel. But there are plenty of people who've been writing for ages. You can also about doing scholarship on those kinds of things, but also there's writing from 15th century England, the people who actually lived during that time that you can look at to get a feel for a lot of those kinds of things. Sorry for the jiggling. I left my phone stand in the camper, so I'm having to hold it with my hand. Anyway. So I can't give you specifics on how to go about your research other than to say that it is important, especially if you are, even if you're creating a fictional world. World building is a whole other thing that is can be very challenging, but it's a great opportunity to explore, and you may not be limited by some of the constraints of what is real in science fiction. One of the science fiction novel series that I worked on for a client, our goal was to remain plausible rather than science fiction necessarily. It was fictionalized science, and the way I draw a distinction on that is that basically we looked at the science that exists and imagined where it could go in the next decade or 2 decades or whatever, and that is how we constrained ourselves for the world we were building there. But we did go beyond what actually exists right now. If you're dealing with other, Harry Potter is a perfect example. That's not a world that actually exists, but there are elements of it that may or may not be real, and so you get to use your imagination, and you're not necessarily bound by what is realistic and what is plausible, because that's expected in that genre. But if you are just doing a period romance piece, or even if it's a modern romance piece, but it's set in a country separate from where you live, and you don't have the means to be able to go to that country and visit it, fortunately, we live in the age of the internet where you are able to take virtual tours of things and listen to native speakers and all of that. So there's so much out there that can facilitate your research, but it is important to do the research. It's not the most fun part of it because, most of us left school hoping we'd never have to do another research paper. Even those of us who write, we still don't relish the idea of doing a research paper. But in order to create a world that resonates with your reader and feels real, because the characters have to come alive off of that backdrop. That's a foundational part of getting started. After, once you have your idea, and doing your research may shape your idea and take your story in a different direction than what you thought it was going to go. So that is, I would say, step one. Step two is, let's do, that's 1B. 1A, if you'll forgive me, is is getting a solid idea of the story you want to tell. You have an idea. The next thing to do is to sit with that idea, mull on it, see where you want to take the characters. Story, the conventional 3-part or 3-act story arc exists for a reason. It's because it works, and because that is the most effective way to take a reader or a listener or a viewer on a journey and have them invested to come along the whole way with you. The 3 parts, in case you're not familiar, are the setup, the conflict, and the resolution. And I look at it as kind of like a bell curve. Most of I would say the first half of your story is going to be that setup. That's building your world, introducing characters, establishing their relationships, showing who they are and how they navigate their world, um, and um, and maybe establishing who your protagonist and your antagonist are. And then you come to your conflict, which is like that turning point, that pivotal moment in whatever situation you're setting up in your story, where people have to make a decision. They have to take action, or they have to cease action, or whatever it may be, and then go forward with the information they have from whatever that pivotal moment was. And then the remain, and that's really, I would say, about 25%. And then the remaining 25% of the manuscript is the resolution. You know, what happens, what's the fallout? How did they get back home, or how did they find the person they're looking for who disappeared in that conflict moment, or whatever the case may be. But you need to get an idea of what that's going to look like for you and your story. Because until you have that, you could do research all day long, but you may be chasing rabbits and not be getting the kind of research that you actually need. I've made that mistake in the past where I tried to research as I went, and that was so much more cumbersome, took a lot more time. It took me out of my writing zone too often, to where getting the book written was really challenging for me. So, and obviously you're not going to be able to anticipate everything you're going to need to research, but if you have your story mapped out, and after, and that's like, get your basic summary story arc, and then go and try to write out chapter summaries. Figure out how many chapters you think it's going to take to tell your story, how many, what part of the story plays out in each chapter. That's going to tell you if you're trying to cover too much or not enough in a chapter, so you can revise that before you really get into the nitty-gritty of writing. And that's also going to give you a good place to start for your research. If you're telling, like in my case, I'm telling the story of a guy who ends up going on a road trip. And so I need to research the different locations he's going to visit along the way. I need to get a good understanding of what resources he's going to take with him, what happens if those resources are taken away for some reason, and how does he adapt? And so I do research on those things to be able to have a working knowledge as I'm writing, so that I'm not constantly having to stop and look up something. But as you're writing, because it is a living and breathing experience and entity, you may write something or take your character in a direction, and you're like, oh, I don't really know what happens there. So I do need to look up, if he has to have this kind of tool. I wasn't anticipating that. And so now I need to understand, what that tool looks like, how it functions, where I can get one, those kinds of things. So that's, you do that, and then that tees up your ability to do effective research. And doing those things is going to give you a really good foundation for when you actually start writing. So what I have done so far in this particular novel, I had my idea about what I wanted the story to be. I played with it for several months, and as I was traveling and doing my research on the locations and everything, I played more with who I thought the character should, what his backstory is, what his interests and desires are, who he's going to come in contact with, and what's the end game on it. That, and I was not certain about that for a very long time. I had a general idea of what might happen at the end of this road trip, but I didn't really know for sure. And that can be a challenge, because one of the biggest things is, getting started is really, really hard, but bringing it in for a landing can be way harder. And you'll find that as you're going through your whole writing journey. It's like, where do I stop? or how do I put a bow on this, or if I'm going to do a series, how do I at least bring this one in for a landing so that I can tee up the next one, and that can be tough. And so it really was just a personal experience for me. Actually, after I came off the road of doing my research and was kind of getting back to regular life, that I was like, oh yeah, that's what needs to happen for him. There was a novel that I was working on in the same novel series that I was working on for a client, where I was writing the story, and before I knew it, I was killing off a character, and I was taken aback by it. I was, do I want to do that really? And I had to sit with myself for a while, and I reread everything, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of that's where her road ends, and that is what necessarily has to happen, not just for this story, but for what I knew we were going to do in subsequent stories. You don't always have the benefit of that knowledge, but you're going to surprise yourself with directions you might take a character or a situation, and so with this, I had my revelation about where I wanted him to end up. And that enabled me to go ahead and get my chapter summaries written and all mapped out to where I really had a good handle on where to take the story. And after that, I started, and actually, I will say, I had written the first chapter before I finished my chapter summaries, and that's okay. I'm not going to tell you that there is any specific rule that you have to follow when you're writing, whether that's nonfiction or fiction. Sometimes you need, if you're inspired by something, you need to get it out of your head and on the page so you can see whether or not it has any legs to pursue it. If it's constantly rattling around in your brain, it may never take any kind of form that is useful. You may chase it forever without ever actually doing anything with it. So, whatever process works best for you in your creation mode is what I would encourage you to do. I'm just sharing with you some of the tips that I give my clients and that I use for my own writing. But so I did write, hey bud, I did write the first chapter just because I wanted to get a feel for what kind of tone I was going to have, what narrative voice I was going to use, and what felt right. And then I also just kind of wanted to, I also just wanted to see how it felt to do this, because I've been writing for other people and other people's voices for so long that being able to write in my own, or in my own creation, I just kind of wanted to see how that felt. But it was really important for me to get the chapter summaries done, because I really didn't know where to go after that chapter. So I think that's probably enough for this session. I will film another and give you some insights on how things are going out in the camper later this week or next week. Anyway, happy writing, guys. I hope you will consider the journey of writing as not a labor and as something that is beneficial to you, whether you show it to anybody or not. Thanks. Bye.
The open road is calling, it's got stories to tell. I've got a few of my own.